He's fine. All right. Can you wave? Say hi to everybody. Hi. Good evening. Thanks for joining us. It is a great time to be here. If you're just joining us for the first time, I just encourage you to continue to follow along and take notes and do the best you can. I would encourage you to look back. This is session 17 of our discipleship series. We believe it's very, very important for us to know the Scripture, to know the Word of God, to know the narrative of Scripture, to know what the Bible is telling us, and to understand its implications so that we have the foundation of how we can move forward. And we've just finished the introduction, as it were, into this narrative. We get the creation stories and their call to us to continue to trust the story. And we continue to see failure over and over and over again from people. And about the time where if you're really paying attention, following along, and you feel like, they're just never going to figure this out, about the time where you think you're going to lose hope, we're introduced to this guy named Avram in the back end of Genesis chapter 11. And he is quite a character who teaches us, not without his flaws, but he teaches us what it looks like to actually trust God's story and trust his calling and trust his work. And his family gets it right and gets it wrong and gets it right and gets it wrong. And through all these struggles, but God still works because they have this chutzpah about them, this fire inside of them, this unwillingness to just settle and say this is enough, and even to the point that we see Avram negotiating with God over. Remember, we talked about this last week. He in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, we see Abraham negotiating with God to try to save the people of Sodom and Gomorrah, and so it's just quite a contrast of peoples. And so the story of Joseph, he finds himself being the protector of his people, of the people of Israel, the people of Jacob, right? His family. He was the second in command of all Egypt because of through slavery and a pit of imprisonment, and finally finds his way to the throne, or to second in command of all Egypt, second only to Pharaoh, and we see this whole narrative, and it leaves off all of the people of Israel, of the house of Israel, are brought to Egypt. And we're going to talk this week about these competing narratives that are going on. And this is going to be an important conversation throughout the rest of the Old Testament that we go through. This competing narrative. And so I want to set that stage today. There's a great study if you have time and have the desire. Focus on the Family puts out this study. I believe it's called So the World May Know, by Ray Vonderlaan. Great series. We're going to take some of the things from that this week that are going to lead us into an understanding of what's going on. Where do we find ourselves? We find ourselves in the land of Goshen. It is the Nile River Delta. And we're going to talk first about why this is so important. There are competing narratives here. This people of Israel, we immediately look at this position that they're in, and we immediately go to the Exodus. They're hard pressed. But that's not what they came into. That's not what they came into at all. They came into this world, brought into this world of Egypt. And I don't know if you've ever known the creation story of the people of Egypt, but it goes something like this. The earth was void and without form, and the gods are on a boat over the water. And Ra somehow happens to start the work of creation, and he and the other gods work together to find this way of creation, and they make the earth and the land and everything that's in it, and they're struggling with it because it's chaos. It's still chaos. And so there's this space between the creation and these gods that created it, and this lack of control has the gods nervous, so they put what would be the equivalent to a high priest, a leader that would be part God and part human, to maintain this order and to help establish order on the earth. Do you know who that might be? That is Pharaoh. See, Pharaoh is more than just a king. He is, in real basic terms, he is a chief priest. He is a chief communicator of the gods to the people. He is a ruler. And this is the narrative that we find ourselves in. Sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it? Seems very almost biblical, right? But there are some things that are very different here. The gods are on a boat on the water, as opposed to the Spirit of God is merahephet, right? It is hovering over the water. God speaks and does things on purpose and creates this creation, and He calls it what? He says it's good. He says it's good. And here's the thing. In this Egyptian narrative where Pharaoh is the pinnacle of creation, Pharaoh is the maintainer of order. He is the chief priest of creating order. The challenge then becomes what? How do you keep order? And where does that order come from? Well, if that order comes from Pharaoh, that means order flows through wherever Pharaoh is. It requires settling somewhere. A king, a ruler of this type that is the mouthpiece for the gods cannot wander from place to place. He has to have a specific place that he calls home. And so you can only experience this order and this goodness, as it were, if you are right there. Where in God's kingdom, what we will call shalom, what God has called for goodness and peace, and He has called us to do what? What is the message of those creation stories? What is the message of those creation stories? Chelsea, person over there. What's the story of the creation stories? What's the message of the creation stories? Trust. God has called us to trust Him. kind of an important thing, right? Because where is it possible to know God? Wherever you find yourself, right? So this is these two challenging narratives, these two cultural narratives. We have the God-centered biblical narrative that we will call shalom, peace. And this is God's mission to put everything back in order, to lead us back to trusting the story. And what we're going to hear throughout this Exodus happening and throughout this mission of God is that God is trying to turn His people into a nation of what? A kingdom of what? Anybody? Kingdom of priests. God says, come and find me. And He says, I'll be here. I'll be here. Wherever you are, you can be known. We can yada. We can know one another wherever you are. It requires you to be wherever you are. This is God's overwhelming call. So the people of Israel come to Egypt as a nomadic people, right? They live in tents. They build statues. They build altars to God out of stone that are permanent, but they live in tents because they can move wherever God leads them. They know that God is right there with them wherever they are. Pharaoh, on the other hand, this story of empire is Pharaoh is wherever he puts himself. And the thing about empire is at some point you have to build a kingdom to be a king. Yeah? You got to build a bunch of stuff. There's got to be evidence long beyond you being here that you were here. There's got to be an impact. So you start to gather wealth. You start to gather more than enough. And things that you don't even need. You just want. Wants become motivating things. You want people to know that you are here. You want these massive things to happen. And every once in a while, this story of empire requires some type of authoritative action to let people know, hey, I'm still in charge. I'm still in charge. This is still how it goes. And one of the problems with this narrative of empire is on some level, at some point, someone becomes more valuable. Which means in order for someone to become more valuable, what also has to happen? Something or someone becomes less valuable. Something or someone becomes expendable. And Ray Vander Laan says it this way. If you see a culture where life is cheap and sacrifice of others is acceptable to sustain your own obsession with pleasure and wealth, then you have the wrong story. If you see a culture where life is cheap and sacrifice of others, of other lives, is acceptable to sustain your own obsession with pleasure and wealth, you have the wrong story. See, these are these two competing views. This call of peace of God is to recognize the downcast, the lost, the hopeless, the helpless, and to do for them what they can't do for themselves. To continue to think about them, to give to them, to remember them, to reach out to them. But this story of empire, on some level, builds up ourself, builds up someone at the expense of someone else. Yeah. Right. That's right. That's right. That's right. And there's so much. There's so much here. But these two competing narratives, this is where the people of Israel find themselves. And we're going to get into what that looks like. The challenge is exactly like what you talked about in self-preservation and in self-control. Talking about Proverbs 14. We have this challenge every day. We have this challenge to deal with every day, just like this is where the children of Israel find themselves. And the question that we have to answer is, what narrative are we buying into? What narrative are we buying into? Because if we believe that the gospel somehow empowers us to set up a kingdom unto ourselves, to collect an abundance and to hold on to it, then we are missing that call of shalom. Because here's what we're going to see. We're going to see these people in the land of Goshen. And just like I just said, we know the land of Goshen is where again? The land of Goshen is where? The Nile Delta, northern Egypt. What happens in the land of Goshen every single year? It floods. In a drought, it floods. In a heavy rain year, it floods. It floods all the time. Matter of fact, National Geographic did an article about the best farmland in all of the world. Number 3 was the volcanic topsoil of the Pacific Northwest. And they were taking cross sections of the depth of topsoil. You know how deep the topsoil is in the Pacific Northwest? Just short of 6 feet. Fertile topsoil, like 5.8 feet, which is a pretty deep, which I think just standing up, all you people just saw was. Anyway, it's as tall as me. That's the average topsoil, fertile topsoil in that area. Number 2 on that list, Northern Plains, or the Central Plains, the High Plains here in the U.S., which would be Kansas, Nebraska kind of area. Just over 6 feet of fertile topsoil. And that's some good soil for planting. Obviously, we take advantage of it in America. We grow everything there. Corn, wheat by the miles, right? Number 1, the Goshen Valley, the Nile Delta. You want to take any stabs at how deep the fertile, you're cheating. How deep the fertile soil is. It is more than 25 feet, Chelsea said. It's more than 50 feet. It's 100 feet of fertile topsoil. Not even close. I can't stand up and show you that, sorry. The most fertile land in the world. And in these videos, so the world should know, Ray Vonderlaan opens standing in this barley field in in this place in the Goshen Valley with barley up over his waist, green. And at one point it pans back and shows you the whole thing, and it gets to the edge, and it gets there really quickly before it changes over. But this barley field where they grow thick, lush barley and grains, when it stops, where the flood comes to, where it stops, it is a dead straight line, and it turns into exactly what you think of when you think of Egypt: sand, barrenness, and nothing. Why wouldn't he build on the Goshen? Because it floods. Do you build your house on a floodplain? No. So this is why. Who's doing the mapping? Well, hopefully the Corps. Anyway, so this is why this is so significant. They gave this land to the people of Israel when they came to Egypt, because they were like, well, you guys are already nomadic and there's farmland over here. You guys farm this and take care of it because we don't want to live there. Why wouldn't an Egyptian want to live there? It's the most fertile land in all the world. But it floods. They don't want to move all the time. They are a people of empire. They want to build a house, build out their opulence, show how important and powerful they are by having more and more and more and more. Sounds pretty familiar, but we're going to continue on from that. So those places where it floods all the time, they don't want to be there. Well, the people of Israel, they're already nomadic people. They already live in tents and temporary housing. So we'll go and farm about 7 or 8 months out of the year. And the 4 or 5 months that it floods, that's fine. We'll just pick up our stuff and we'll go do something else. And when they saw that they were skilled, Pharaoh said, hey, I've got some good options for you. Let me give you a vacation home, and I'll pay you a wage so you can earn a living over these 4 or 5 months. So they went into the service of Pharaoh. So Pharaoh has these infrastructure jobs. We're going to build roads. We're going to build temples. We're going to build tombs. We're going to build all of these things. And one of the things that's really interesting about Egypt at this time, what makes them the most powerful nation in the world at the time? Nope, that's the Romans. That comes later. It's not the roads. It's not water. It's steel. They could make the strongest steel because they knew how to heat the fire the hottest. Their furnaces would burn at 600 to 700 degrees, which was unheard of at the time. Bakes bread really, really fast. They could make the strongest steel, which made them the most powerful. What is steel and metal typically used for? 2 things, yes, weapons and railroad tracks. Tools. Weapons and tools. Primary use for metal even today. Weapons and tools. Well, who was using the tools? The Hebrews were. So they were making, designing, and developing tools to be more and more efficient. But here's the thing about a 600 or 700 degree temperatured furnace. If you're working in those conditions, what's happening? Somebody's dying. It's just going to happen. We live in the most advanced time ever in recorded history. Do people still die because of workplace accidents? Absolutely. People get injured, maimed, and die because of workplace accidents. I'm just going to tell you, OSHA wasn't around. These servants and these people who are working in and near these furnaces, some of them died. And the challenge is that as empire grows, that costliness of those lives isn't significant, right? So what was the land of Goshen like? It was full of fertile soil. It was great soil. And the challenge kind of looks like this. You see this image of maybe a priest of the river god standing on the edge of this barley field with 1 foot in waist-deep barley and 1 foot in the desert. And we hear the echoes of the call of Joshua. Choose you this day whom you're going to serve. Like if we see that image and we're called to that, which God is the God of plenty? Which God is the God of enough? The God that is calling you out into the desert, into this dry and barren place, or the God who provides every year like clockwork this overwhelming abundance of grain and food? Which one? Here's what's crazy too. We might have some challenges in the American church today making the right decision. On which God is the right one to serve. And this is a challenge. We have to answer this. Which narrative are we buying into? Are we buying into this empire narrative that says Pharaoh is here and providing order and providing more than enough, and you have all that you can need right here? Why would you go anywhere else? Obviously, the blessing of the Lord is right here. And the challenge becomes, over time, and we see this echoed in the book of Joshua. We see it echoed in the book of Deuteronomy. We see it echoed in the book of Ezekiel even. At some point, we have to choose. And the question is, which one would you choose? The challenge becomes the people of Israel, the Hebrew people, they took up these gods of Egypt. They chose to worship these gods of Egypt. What is that image that keeps coming to mind that they made multiple times? This golden calf. This bull. The image of a cow. I mean, who wants to worship a cow? I have cows. Not that fascinating. I mean, they do what I want them to do, but I would never consider them deity. Like, oh, thing that my food comes from. Not a thing. Thank you for dinner. I will say that. Like, literally, I have a calf. Named him Dinner. But anyway. But the people of Israel began to give in to this Egyptian narrative. Because Pharaoh not only were they working the good land of the Goshen and always having plenty, but when they weren't able to do that and it flooded, Pharaoh brought them into his service and provided all that they needed. Matter of fact, this is the negotiation. This is what it looked like. They worked 10-day work weeks, 8 to 9 hours a day. They had 2 to 3 day weekends or breaks at the end of those 10 days. They got paid a fair wage, and Pharaoh provided a 3-bedroom place for them to live. This is a true story. Sounds pretty familiar, doesn't it? It's not uncommon to what life looks like now. So they never had to worry. This is the condition that they found themselves in. And the call of God is, will you follow me away from here and into the desert, back to this place where I called you from, even though it's hard? Or are you going to choose to remain in the barley fields and in the service of the Pharaoh? Which one would you choose? That's the challenge, isn't it? The easy way. And so how do you deal with that? The question, there's this new question that arises. There's this new question that we have to struggle with, that God has to struggle with. It's a different question because it's not going to be that challenging to do something crazy and to convince a few of his people to leave Egypt, or some of his people to leave Egypt. The question that God is now having to wrestle with, that we have to learn how to wrestle with, is, how do I get Egypt out of my people? This is the greater challenge. This is the move of God and what He is trying to do. God says, I want to know my people intimately, but in order for me to know them intimately, this narrative of empire has to be removed from them. The question is, how is that possible? How do you take a people who are so comfortable living this way and lead them out of it? One way is to give them exactly what they want. You're struggling with a child who is in his formative years or her formative years. They're teenagers. They're really bucking the system. They want to fight with you over all the things that you're doing, that you're responsible for, that they feel like is unfair. How do you deal with that? And help them to understand, give them everything that they want. By that, I do not mean buy them everything that they want. I mean, give them exactly what they want. Complete responsibility. And let them figure out how much something costs and how valuable what they're getting is. So what does God do? Gives them exactly what they want. What they want. Because empire only leads one direction. Empire only leads to one direction. Because at some point the pinnacle isn't high enough. right? At some point, the pinnacle isn't high enough. It has to be higher. In order for it to be higher, in order for someone to be exalted higher and to be made of more importance, that means more people have to be made less important. And that's where the book of Exodus tells us that Joseph and his generation died. And there arose a Pharaoh who didn't know Joseph and didn't know the way of his people. And he saw this multitude of people and he said, I've got a great idea. These skilled people, they can work for me. They can make my name greater than any other name, but it takes their hardship. They're a threat to me. So what do? They start tossing babies in the Nile River. They start killing people. Empire is so great until that empire turns around and crushes you. You know, they say you can never have too much of a good thing. Well, you can have too much of a bad thing. So this empire is now a crushing weight. And here's the thing. It is so powerful and so oppressive that it creates this crying out of the people, this za'akah that we talked about last week. But what's interesting is the Bible never says that the people of God cry out to God specifically. It's just God recognizes and He says, I've heard the cry of my people. This should be such a comforting thing. That it doesn't matter where you find yourself, if you feel oppressed, if you feel hurt, if you feel this pressure of empire crushing you, it is a cry out. It doesn't even have to be specifically to God. But He hears the downtrodden and the hurt. Why? Because His target, the target of shalom, the target of God's narrative is what? To restore. To yada, to know you. To care for the downtrodden and the broken and the hurt, and to be overwhelmingly hospitable. And we see this image that comes up that is a symbol of Pharaoh's power. In all the images of Pharaoh that you see in hieroglyphics, if you think back to different things that you've seen, what image do you see of Pharaoh? What's in his hand? A staff. It's actually almost a direct replica of a shepherd's crook. And in death, they're holding it across their chest. But in life, they're holding it out over the people. That stick, that staff is a symbol of authority, of power, of strength, of ruling through strength. It's the message of follow Pharaoh's way or else. This is why the first interaction with Pharaoh from Moses is so significant. We find it in Exodus chapter 7. In Exodus chapter 7, I'm going to start in verse 6 because I think it's significant, and then we'll go on to where it is. It's actually in verse 8 through 13. Exodus chapter 7, verse 6 says, Moses and Aaron did just as the Lord commanded them. Moses was 80 years old, and Aaron 83 when they spoke to Pharaoh. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, when Pharaoh says to you, perform a miracle, then say to Aaron, take your staff and throw it down before Pharaoh, and it will become a snake, a serpent. So Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and did just as the Lord commanded. Aaron threw his staff down in front of Pharaoh and his officials, and it became a snake. Pharaoh then summoned wise men and sorcerers, and the Egyptian magicians, not musicians, magicians also did the same thing by their secret arts, by their witchcraft, by their so this wasn't something that was significant. They brought this stick, the staff, the shepherd's crook, threw it on the ground, it became a serpent. All these wise sorcerers and wise men and crazy people and different priests of different gods come and throw their sticks on the ground, and they become serpents as well. And I'm about to read something that maybe you've never actually paid attention to before. Each one threw down his staff and it became a snake. But Aaron's staff swallowed up their staffs. What's the significance of what's going on here? Here's why I asked this question. Because I'm asking the question that is leading us to this question. Who is God angry at? Why is God angry, and who is He at war with? In Exodus chapter 6, verse 7, He tells Moses and Aaron, go and do this and say this to the people, because I'm going to do something and reach out my right hand in strength so that my people may know Yada, to experience, to know me, to experience that I am powerful and that there's none like me. So God's not angry with His people for taking up the gods of Egypt. God's heart is to redeem His people. Right? So then, who's God angry with? Well, it must be the Egyptians. Right? But Exodus chapter 7, verse 5, God tells Moses and Aaron, no, I'm doing this, and I am going to stretch out my right hand and extend my hand and show my power so that the people of Egypt will know that I am God. So if God's not angry with His people, and God's not angry with the Egyptians, surely... Right, so He's talking about in Genesis, Lucifer, or even the beginning, Lucifer asking to share power. So then, God's obviously not angry with His people, not angry and at war with the Egyptians. Well, then, is He at war with Pharaoh? Is that the target? Is He trying to share power with God and take the position of God? And the answer we find in Exodus chapter 8, verse 10, no. He's not at war with Pharaoh. He says, I'm stretching out my right hand. I'm doing these mighty works so that you, when Moses speaking to Pharaoh, saying that you may know that there is no God in all the earth like our God. Yada, to know. So God's heart is that the people of Israel would know Him. That the people of Egypt would know Him. And even that Pharaoh would know Him. So who is He at war with? And what we're going to see over the next couple of weeks is that God is at war with the gods of Egypt. Because He's given His people who have accepted this narrative of empire and kingdom building unto yourself. And they've allowed that to rule and reign until the point where it starts to crush them. But God has to answer the question. I've given them empire to the point where now it's crushing them. So how now do I get Egypt out of my people, except that I demonstrate my power and authority over all of these gods and show them to be lesser and call my people to follow me? This is the war that God is at. God is at war with the gods of Egypt. And He has just demonstrated in this very first interaction that image of authority and power that is in the hand of Pharaoh and multiplied by his sorcerers is consumed by that same shepherd's staff in the hand of God. Because God's call for us as His people, His call is He is calling His people not to depend on a priest, not to depend on someone to tell them what the message is, not to have to run to someone else. But God's call is to lead His people, you and I, to be a kingdom of priests, to learn how to be the message. To be the message. This is the call of Moses. God is looking for a leader for these people, and He finds Moses. He finds this man who has his heart. He's motivated by compassion. He sees the abuse and the hurt of people, and he runs to act. Now, he doesn't quite have God's methods just yet, because God doesn't respond to hardship by killing a whole bunch of people. He responds by restoring those who are broken. And God's going to work through Moses and eventually find him in the standing in front of Pharaoh. And He continues to tell Moses, hey, I want you to go and tell Pharaoh this is what's going to happen. And I need you to be obedient to me in the presence of Pharaoh so that he can see that I am God and there's no one like me. And that's what God is calling us to. He's calling us to be the message. If you want to be in preparation for the weeks that are coming, the next couple of weeks that are coming, you should read up on the plagues. And we're going to talk about the implications of those and what they mean and what this war really looks like. But for today, we need to understand this narrative that is going to be echoed throughout all of the rest. This is a struggle that is going to go on throughout all of the rest of Scripture that we talk about and that we are going to deal with every single day in our own life. Is which narrative, which kingdom are we going to choose? Are we going to choose the one of empire and self-development and exaltation of either ourself or something else other than God? And that being our supply and our more than enough? Or are we going to trust God, and is our standard of giving and our standard of hospitality and our standard of service going to be what defines us? Are we going to be the message? Are we going to be the message because we are kingdom of priests who are always looking for, listening for the cry of people who are hurt and downtrodden and looking to restore them back to the place that God intended for them to be? Or are we people who are consumed with how do I take care of me and mine and have more than enough? And that's the challenge. And we're going to spend some time about the implications of empire today in our discussion groups. I want to invite you, if you're watching online, um, to get with us in person, to reach out to us, because there's so much good stuff that God is wanting to do, and it takes us being together and being connected. So come and join us at 10:30 on Sunday morning. We'd love to have you. Amen. Have a great week.